The shadow of its crimes has never ceased to weigh upon the empire on which the sun never sets. British colonialism was a global crime masked under the banners of progress, civilization, and democracy. In fact, it was a system of plunder and extermination on a planetary scale from India to the Caribbean, Africa, and Australia, leaving deep scars in global underdevelopment and current economic inequalities. They pretend to lecture the world about democracy, but only 60 years ago did they barely exit an age of global pillaging called colonialism. The British Empire, which once brutally controlled a quarter of the planet in its insatiable hunger for resources, now wears the garments of neocolonialism. It controls through banks, corporations, treaties, and cultural pressure what it once controlled with cannons and famine. The history of this criminal empire is not a glorious tale of civilization, but one of blood, genocide, theft of resources, and destruction of cultures, crimes they refuse to acknowledge, even while claiming to stand on a moral pedestal. In truth, the world today is still paying the price of the British Empire, from frozen conflicts to systemic poverty in former colonies, from the cost of deliberate famine, slavery, and destruction of local economies, while London carefully preserves the wealth amassed through colonial theft. The British Empire left behind a mountain of corpses and a system of global inequity that continues to define today's world. More than formal apologies and empty speeches are needed. What's needed is moral and financial reparations, full recognition of the crimes committed, and a real effort to support the countries destroyed by British colonialism in rebuilding their own future. Until then, any lesson in democracy coming from Britain remains a bitter irony, and the moralism exported from London wobbles on foundations built on the blood of others. Let us not forget that beneath the gilding of civilization lay genocide, racism, and looting, and that true civilization only begins when one acknowledges their crimes and pays the debt of history. What follows is a rather extensive article, because the misfortunes caused by this great empire over centuries are countless and beyond imagination. Yet even so, many aspects of this tragic and horrifying subject remain unaddressed here. Many will forget what they read here quite quickly, or worse, will be indifferent, or perhaps will agree with these actions committed by the British. But I hope that even more will reflect on all this and find the courage to speak to others about the lies, demagoguery, wars, and unimaginable crimes through which humanity is still being led today by a handful of highly developed states, disasters that are propagandistically camouflaged with terms like democracy, progressivism, civilization, inclusion, equality, etc. The British Empire, the largest empire in history, dominated a quarter of the globe, ruling over more than 400 million people, built on systematic looting, genocides, and exploitation. Under the mask of a civilizing mission, Britain implemented a model of capital accumulation through violence, cultural destruction, and extermination. While projecting itself as a beacon of democracy, it established regimes of terror in the colonies, banned local voting, and systematically looted the wealth of the colonies. The British parliamentary system was built upon slavery, colonial looting, and genocide. The British Empire began with the oppression of its Irish and Scottish neighbors, then moved on to commercial colonies India, North America, expanding through the East India Company. In 1757, at Plassey, the British conquered Bengal. By 1858, India was fully under British control. Later came Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. The slave trade, a global economic crime, the hidden foundation of imperial wealth. Britain transported over 3 million African slaves to its colonies, a quarter of whom died en route, making it one of the most active nations in the transatlantic slave trade. British cities such as Bristol, Liverpool, London, and Glasgow became financial centers thanks to the slave trade through the Royal African Company and other merchants. Huge profits financed banks, universities, and British industry. Lloyd's of London, Barclays, Oxford, and Cambridge all have direct ties to slavery. The triangular trade, weapons to Africa, slaves to the Caribbean, sugar and cotton to Europe, was a global criminal network that lasted over 2 centuries. Current British politicians, including David Cameron, directly inherited significant wealth built on the slave trade. India was transformed into an extraction economy. Cotton, tea, opium all fed British industrial machinery and factories. British textiles destroyed India's artisanal industries. Repeated famines, Bengal 1770, 1943, were caused by forced export policies. Africa's resources, gold, copper, rubber, ivory, were extracted through forced labor with no local benefit. From the Caribbean to India, from Ireland to Kenya, the British Empire operated on the same principles: maximum extraction of resources with minimal investment, maintaining order through force, contempt for local cultures, and the justification of these actions through an ideology of civilizing barbarians. It became the most extensive empire in history, controlling territories on all continents. The height of British dominance was in the 19th century, when Britain became the global hegemon. Colonization was justified through a mixture of economic interests, racist ideologies, and pseudo-humanitarian doctrines, which had devastating effects on colonized peoples. British colonialism arose in the context of European maritime expansion and was fueled by a blend of commercial interests, theological justifications, and modern ideologies. Philosopher and economist John Locke (163–1704) justified the expropriation of unused lands by natives. Adam Smith (17–1790), considered the father of modern economics, was an indirect supporter of colonialism, with his vision of free trade and the economic benefits of commercial expansion. Charles Darwin (1809–1882), naturalist and author of The Theory of Evolution Through Natural Selection, influenced by the era's ideas of racial superiority, wrote in The Descent of Man, 1871, that some cultures and peoples were less evolved than others, statements later interpreted as a justification for British imperial expansion. Thomas Malthus (1766–1834), economist and demographer, supported the idea that colonial expansion could offer solutions for population growth and resource scarcity in Britain. In an essay on the principle of population 1798, Malthus argued that a growing population requires expansion and additional resources to prevent poverty and famine. Colonizing new territories provides a necessary outlet for an expanding population that would otherwise suffer from a lack of resources. We are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Cecil Rhodes. I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine is their fault for breeding like rabbits. Winston Churchill. The labor of Negroes on plantations is the only form of work suitable for this lazy and immoral species. Thomas Carlyle. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed to serve your captive's need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Rudyard Kipling. These were not isolated exceptions but part of the dominant worldview that justified slavery, rape, beatings, and forced labor of women and children, deliberate famines, and summary executions, all under the pretext of civilizing. Though impossible to quantify precisely, conservative historical estimates suggest that Britain's slave trade caused around 750,000 deaths during transit, 30 million deaths in India through famine, execution, or repression, over 1 million deaths in Ireland, hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal Australians exterminated, millions of Native Americans and Africans killed through conflict, famine, and forced labor. In total, British colonialism can be estimated to have directly and indirectly destroyed over 50 million lives. The expression perfidious Albion, Albion perfide, originated in France and dates back to the 13th century, but became common in the modern era, starting in the 18th century. Perfidious Albion is more than a propaganda slogan. It is a historical summary of the British Empire's modus operandi, characterized by diplomatic betrayal, systematic colonization, expropriation, geopolitical manipulation, and ideological deception. The term was used in reaction to Britain's duplicitous attitude toward France and its allies. It has been echoed over time by many politicians, writers, and thinkers from France and other countries. Albion, an old poetic name for England, has become synonymous with diplomatic hypocrisy, betrayal of allies' interests, and colonialism disguised as free trade. Today, when it preaches democracy to the world, we must ask why we should believe a power that built its wealth and influence on betrayal and global theft. Britain has a long tradition of betrayals and duplicity in foreign policy. Ireland and Scotland, the first English colonies, the Empire's laboratories. When discussing British colonialism, most people think of India, Africa, or the Americas. But before England conquered faraway territories, it began by subjugating its closest neighbors, first Ireland, then Scotland. These two regions should not be viewed merely as natural parts of today's United Kingdom, excluding the Republic of Ireland, but as territories conquered and controlled through methods that would later be exported worldwide. Ireland and Scotland were, therefore, the first laboratories of British imperialism. Military occupation strategies, forced colonization, suppression of language and culture, imposition of dominant religion, and expropriation of native populations through looting and violence were all tested here. Ireland, the first true colonization of Ireland by England, began as early as the 12th century. After the conquerors came settlers, who spread throughout the island, especially in Munster and Ulster. By the early 18th century, almost a third of Ireland's population was of immigrant origin, descendants of approximately 350,000 Protestant settlers from the previous century. These settlers brought with them the English language, fashion, culture, and commercial methods, while parliamentary legislation banned the Irish language and dress, along with traditional agricultural, social, political, and cultural practices. True colonial policies emerged in the 16th-17th centuries when English kings, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, sought to control the entire island. To do so, they invented a system called plantations. Lands confiscated from Catholic Irish were distributed to English or Scottish Protestant colonists loyal to the crown. Irish peasants were expelled, marginalized, turned into tenants, or forced to work their former lands. The British incursion relied on violence and force. During the 9 Years' War, from 1594 to 1603, English forces used scorched earth tactics and famine to subdue rebels. About 20% of Ireland's population was killed during the 1640s wars. Many civilians died from fighting, exposure, starvation, and disease, alongside deportations, hostage-taking, and displacement. Refugees, mostly women and children, flooded Dublin and other urban centers. First-hand testimonies known as the 1-6-for-1 depositions recorded brutal assaults, forced undressing, torture, rape, and abuse of women. Politicians and propagandists from the 17th to the 20th centuries exploited this trauma to incite fear, fuel sectarianism, and justify repression. The revolution in Irish land ownership, which began with the 17th century plantations and culminated in Cromwellian confiscations and land redistributions after the monarchy's restoration, resulted in the transfer of about 8 million acres from Catholics to Protestants. Furthermore, Irish land and access to Irish labor financed English imperialism in Ireland and beyond, supplying colonies especially in the Atlantic and India. The era of Oliver Cromwell in Ireland, between 1649 and 1653, left an open wound due to the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford meant to crush Catholic rebellion and punish the Irish population, considered perfidious and popish, the deportation of survivors as indentured slaves to Barbados, Jamaica, In America, especially Virginia and New England, and the estimated 600,000 deaths from extreme violence, famine, and disease. Cromwell initiated deportations to pay his army and purify the Irish lands. Although contractual in theory, most Irish were sent against their will, either as prisoners of war, the poor, orphans, or convicts. Officially, deported Irish were not property in the legal sense as Africans were, but they were forced to work for a fixed term, usually 7 to 10 years without pay, without the right to leave, under harsh and often lethal conditions. Many died before release or were left destitute afterward. Over 100,000 Irish were sent as indentured laborers to British colonies, most in conditions equivalent to slavery. Upon arrival, they were treated with disdain by their English masters, viewed as inferior, rebellious papists, or uncivilized. They were made to work sugar plantations under extreme heat, under constant threat of the whip and starvation. In Barbados, the derogatory term redlegs was used for sunburned Irish who lived in misery long after their contracts ended. An English captain wrote in 1656, "Not even the Africans die as fast as these Irish. The sun scorches their skin, and lack of food dries their bones, but they're cheap and plentiful," a French priest wrote in 1660. The Irish are treated worse than dogs and sold in markets like animals. Official Barbados records list Irish names marked as servants for 7 years, servants for life, or runaways, a popular legend passed down in Irish communities in Barbados and Montserrat, where the local language retains Irish influences, says, "Our ancestors came in chains and died in the sugar fields." The deportation of Irish to Barbados and America was one of the first forms of English colonial social engineering. It showed that the empire was willing to sacrifice human lives on a massive scale, not only foreign but also from its own island, for profit. The fact that these victims were never allowed to tell their story makes the silence all the more painful. In this sense, and in many others, Ireland was a true laboratory for the British Empire. Imperial and Anglicization policies were formulated there. Racial ideologies were developed and the tools of empire were tested. Colonial domination techniques. These policies were accompanied by massacres, deliberate famines, and harsh laws banning the Irish language, Catholic religion, and even certain forms of traditional clothing. Practically, Ireland was treated as an inferior territory, and its people as an uneducated race that had to be civilized, a discourse that would become typical of later British colonialism. A brutal example is the Great Irish Famine from 1845 to 1852, when over 1 million Irish died and another 1 million emigrated. Though the famine was caused by a potato blight, the crisis was intentionally worsened by British authorities who refused to halt food exports from Ireland and saw the disaster as an opportunity to cleanse the country of the poor and rebellious. The 1916 Easter Rising was brutally repressed by the British. Their paramilitary forces, the Black and Tans, terrorized rural settlements and committed arson, executions, and rape. Churchill hated Republican Ireland, considered independence a threat to the empire, and firmly supported the use of the Black and Tans against civilians. He considered the Irish famine an unfortunate but inevitable incident and lamented the loss of British control. Following the War of Independence, the Irish Free State was established, but Northern Ireland remained under British rule. The British then provoked a civil war in 1922 to 1923, threatening total war if the treaty was not signed, fracturing the Republican movement. The pro-treaty faction accepted partial independence and were supplied with arms, while the anti-treaty faction demanded a fully independent republic. The final result: thousands dead and a nation nearly destroyed. Ireland became a symbol of resistance to imperial rule, inspiring freedom fighters across the British world and in other European empires. Though Scotland was technically united with England under a political agreement, the 1707 Act of Union, the reality is more complex. Many Scottish regions, especially the Highlands, resisted English domination and were treated as hostile territory. Between the 17th and 18th centuries, some Scots supported the Jacobite cause, seeking to restore a Catholic dynasty overthrown in England by the Protestant Revolution. The Jacobite uprisings culminated in 1746 at Culloden, where British forces brutalized Scottish rebels. After the defeat, the English authorities imposed severe repressive measures. Clan systems were dismantled, wearing kilts and tartans was banned, and Scottish Gaelic was marginalized. Simultaneously, land was confiscated or cleared through the Highland clearances, a process of expropriation and deportation of peasants to make way for large estates or sheep pastures. Tens of thousands were displaced, forced to emigrate, or reduced to powerless labourers. While Scotland's colonial experience differed in form from Ireland's masked by a union, the consequences were similar. Loss of sovereignty, destruction of traditional culture and social structure, imposition of a foreign elite and an ideology of English superiority. A colonial paradigm that begins at home in both Ireland and Scotland. We see the patterns that later characterized British colonialism in India, Africa, or the Caribbean. Military invasion, land expropriation, deportation, marginalization of local languages and religions, imposition of a dominant culture, and resource exploitation for the benefit of the metropole. That's why this examination begins with the British Isles rather than with India. Before the empire conquered the world, England learned to colonize its own neighbors with a violence and efficiency that would become its historic mark. From domination of neighbors to global dominanciance, the methods of control were tested and refined in Ireland and Scotland. England directed its attention to more distant territories. It was not a drastic shift, but a logical extension of the same obsession, expanding power, capturing resources, and imposing a culturally superior model. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, England was in direct competition with other major colonial powers: Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands. With a growing navy and a more articulated imperial ideology, the British Empire began to take shape. Colonizing the Americas, violence, extermination, and slavery. First English colonies in North America appeared in the 17th century, Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. Though often portrayed in official histories as stories of courage and faith, these colonies were built on the destruction of indigenous peoples. Native tribes were displaced, decimated by European diseases, or massacred in wars provoked to expand colonial frontiers. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean and southern North America, Barbados, Jamaica, Carolina, England developed plantation economies based on African slavery. Millions were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in inhumane conditions to produce sugar, cotton, tobacco, or rum for European markets. To justify this brutality, British elites constructed an entire racial ideology claiming the inferiority of Native Americans and Africans, pseudoscientific, yet foundational for European colonialism. Regarding the American War of Independence, from 1775 to 1783, the British Empire tried to hold on to its colonies by force, imposing taxes without representation and suppressing uprisings. Its defeat marked one of the first major failures of British imperialism, but led to a consolidation of British control over Canada, where many loyalists fled after the war. In Canada, the British operated through forced acculturation, subjugation of indigenous populations, and systematic land expropriation. They established residential schools where indigenous children were separated from their families, forbidden to speak their native languages, and subjected to physical and psychological abuse. British colonial policy in Canada contributed to the destruction of indigenous cultural identity, the traumatic effects of which are still felt today. British colonialism in South America, though less known than in Asia or Africa, was active and destructive through a network of economic and political interventions backed by British commercial and banking interests. In the 19th century, the United Kingdom supported coups, imposed unequal trade treaties, and dominated the financial infrastructure of several South American countries, especially Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. The British controlled railways, ports, and raw material exports, turning the region into a semi-colonial space exploited for economic gain. Guyana, located on the northern coast of South America, was one of the most brutally exploited British colonies. Under British control starting in 1814, Guyana was turned into a plantation-based economy driven by slavery. Thousands of Africans were forcibly brought in to work on sugar plantations under inhumane conditions. After the abolition of slavery in 1834, the British introduced a system of indentured labor that replaced slavery with a new form of exploitation. Tens of thousands of Indians and Chinese were brought in as free laborers, but were essentially trapped in a colonial system. This deliberate ethnic engineering created deep social divisions that still persist today. Moreover, Guyana's natural resources, including gold, bauxite, and timber, were ruthlessly exploited by British companies, with little to no benefit for the local population. Independence in 1966 came too late to undo the trauma caused by nearly a century and a half of British domination. India, the crown jewel or a slave colony. India became the British Empire's most important territory. Initially represented by a commercial presence through the East India Company established in 1600, it quickly turned into military and political domination. Through forced alliances, corruption, intervention in internal conflicts, and outright wars, the British gained control over the subcontinent. India became an extraction colony. Raw materials, cotton, spices, opium were exported to Britain, while British industrial goods were forced on the Indian market, destroying local industries. For example, Britain dismantled India's textile industry to impose Manchester textiles, prohibiting local weavers from producing or selling, with brutal punishment for those who resisted. Events like the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856 were officially pitched as defending the Ottoman Empire against Russian aggression, but the real stakes were geopolitical: control over trade routes and access to India. Russia was not allowed to expand into the Balkans and the Mediterranean. France, Britain's ally in this conflict, acted not out of solidarity with Romanians or the Ottomans, but to solidify its influence in Eastern Europe, treating small nations like Romania as instruments in a colonial power play. As President Poincaré later admitted, "We must preserve our influence in Eastern Europe at any cost. Small peoples need the tutelage of great nations." Similarly, General Berthelot or Clemenceau said, "Romanians are a pure and naive people, a perfect colony for our ambitions." Though not a direct colonization war, it was part of imperial influence. Whoever dominated the Eastern Mediterranean controlled access to the East. During the famine of 1876 to 1878, over 5 million Indians died while British authorities continued exporting grain from India to the metropolis. The conquest unfolded progressively, first under the East India Company from 1600 to 1857, then under direct rule from 1858 to 1947. The Amritsar massacre in 1919 symbolized unthinkable colonial brutality when British troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd, killing over 1,000. General Dyer, who commanded the troops, was lionized by British newspapers. The British civilizing discourse masked a cynical reality. India was intentionally kept underdeveloped to serve as both a market for British goods and a resource reservoir. When Indians rebelled, for instance, in the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, the British responded with extreme cruelty, mass massacres, and public executions. Between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted an estimated $45 trillion adjusted to today's value from India. This was organized theft rather than commerce. India, once among the richest civilizations, was systematically impoverished. British destroyed agriculture, regional industry, and traditional governance. They imposed oppressive land tax systems leading to repeated famines. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed 3.5 million people, was no natural disaster but a crime. Winston Churchill, hailed as a British war hero, diverted food from India to feed British soldiers and civilians. Reportedly, he remarked, "It is their own fault for breeding like rabbits." From 1516 until the end of World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1918, Britain conquered it and administered it under a mandate until 1948, when the territory was partitioned into two states through legislation modeled on the Government of Ireland Act Dec 1920, which had previously partitioned Ireland. British administration in Palestine was ambiguous and manipulative, with promises made to both Jews and Arabs that evolved into perpetual conflict and inheritance of British colonialism. In China, the Opium Wars 1840-1856 exemplify economic imperialism. Britain forced China to accept opium trade grown in British India and flooded into China to balance trade deficits. Chinese resistance was crushed militarily, leading to unequal treaties and forced opening of ports to British commerce. Hong Kong was ceded by China to Britain in 1842 via the Treaty of Nanking and remained a British colony until 1997. For over 150 years, it served as a commercial, banking, and military outpost, governed by segregationist policies between local Chinese and British minority residents. Burma Myanmar was conquered in 3 successive wars in 1824, 1852, and 1885, and made a province of British India. Its resources, particularly teak, rice, and opium, were heavily exploited. British colonists imposed education and governance that marginalized local culture and religion. Afghanistan, strategically situated between the Russian Empire and British India, was the site of several Anglo-Afghan wars 1839-1842, 1878-1880, 1919, part of the Imperial Great Game. Although not fully colonized, British influence on Afghan internal politics was deep and often imposed through military intervention and support for puppet leaders. British colonization of Australia began in 1788 with the establishment of the first penal colony at Sydney. In the following decades, thousands of convicts, soldiers, and settlers occupied Aboriginal land. The doctrine of terra nullius legally declared Australia a noun, enabling massive land seizures without treaties or compensation. Aboriginal populations suffered systematic extermination through massacres, starvation, eugenic policies, and disease introduced by Europeans. Frontier conflicts lasted over 140 years. In the 20th century, the government enforced eugenics and forced assimilation. Aboriginal children were taken from their families and raised in Christian institutions or white households, a policy known as the Stolen Generations. In New Zealand, Britain signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori in 1840, but quickly violated it, confiscating land and suppressing resistance. The Maori Wars, from 1845 to 1872, resulted in thousands of deaths and the loss of sacred territories. In both countries, British imperialism was cloaked in a civilizing rhetoric but amounted to cultural eradication, mass violence, and deep social disruption. British expansion accelerated in Africa in the 19th century, especially after the Berlin Conference 1884-1885, when European powers partitioned the continent with no regard for local realities. Territories such as Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe came under British rule. Colonialism here meant forced land confiscation, forced labor, imposition of British legal and language systems, and violent suppression of resistance. The apartheid system in South Africa, official racial segregation, was inspired by British colonial logic, though later intensified by Afrikaner rule. At the same time, Britain portrayed itself as Africa's moral parent, building schools and railroads, but only insofar as they served imperial interests. Infrastructure was used for resource extraction: gold, diamonds, oil, not for genuine development. During the Boer Wars, the British invented the concept of concentration camp, where thousands of women and children died. An empire built on hypocrisy and violence. A key facet of British success was moral hypocrisy. Imperialism was presented as a noble mission, a gift of civilization to backward peoples. Yet the reality on the ground: silent genocides, destroyed cultures, erased identities, millions reduced to slavery or destitution, tells a very different story, one that begins not in Africa or India, but in Ireland and Scotland. Conclusion: British colonialism was not accidental, but systematic. Overall, British colonialism was not a historical aberration but a deliberate, strategically planned enterprise applied systematically across centuries. It was an empire built not only on military superiority but on a worldview that justified one people deciding the fate of others. If we want to grasp the legacy of this empire, including its neocolonial economic forms and institutional racism today, we must reckon with its origins. How England colonized its immediate neighbors before embarking on global conquest. Ethnic fragmentation and arbitrary borders. Colonial borders drawn without regard to local realities caused violent conflicts. Examples include Rwanda, Nigeria, and India-Pakistan. British colonialism was not an age of civilization, but a global order built on violence, theft, racism, and manipulation, leaving behind systemic underdevelopment, extractive infrastructure ideal for neocolonial powers, weak middle classes, and economic dependency. From the Caribbean to the Himalayan plateaus, the British Empire meant slavery, famine, humiliation, mass murder. A profoundly unequal global economy whose imbalance persists today, and an ideological legacy where imperial supremacy was seen as normal. Recognizing these facts is not just historical accuracy, it is essential for global justice. Refusing to acknowledge colonialism today as a historic crime perpetuates domination by forgetting colonialism and imperialism today. These forms of domination and plunder did not vanish, they were rebranded, from physical colonies to financial, cultural, and informational ones, from chained slaves to debt-laden workers. Maps, ideologies, and language have evolved, but the reality remains. We still live under a form of global domination disguised as freedom. Modern slavery is a refined version of colonial slavery. Chains become contracts, whips become social pressure, plantations become offices, factories, and digital platforms where most work to survive rather than to live. Wages are just enough to survive, never enough to free the masses, which keeps around 70–80% of the global population in a modern servitude with a human face. Britain's royalty, institutions, and elites still benefit from this historical plunder. The king and his descendants retain lands and treasures amassed during the colonial era. The British Museum holds hundreds of thousands of looted artifacts but refuses to return them. Even today, many in Britain remain unaware or indifferent to these crimes. Schools teach heroic empire stories. The media avoids the full truth. The moral hypocrisy is staggering. While human rights violations abroad are condemned, their own history remains unacknowledged. While British schools teach hero-scripted tales of civilizing savages, the harsh reality is millions dead, ruined economies, deliberate conflicts, destroyed families, and erased cultures. From Africa to India, from the Caribbean to Ireland, the British Empire remains responsible for historical tragedies whose effects linger, and moralizing from London demands one question: when will it truly take responsibility for its history?